Can you make him the big screen spotlight him? Spotlight Peter.
Spotlight
it. Okay, Peter, you spotlighted.
This is an exciting moment.
I'm so excited you're here with us. Thank you. Thank you. This guy is amazing. I've been carrying his book around with me so much that I take it to bed with it.
Are we ready to start?
We're ready to go.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, everybody. It's exciting to kind of share where a lot of the work that we were doing here in San Francisco and around the world that really came out of Web 2 and engaging cities with everyone here as we are plugging kind of Web 3 and the metaverse and new set of values into cities. This is this book, The Maker City, which really came out of a collaboration that went on between the Maker movement, a bunch of us doing civic innovation, and President Obama. So what I wanted to share with you today was a bit of what we did, a bit of what we learned, and perhaps how it applies to everything going on now. So now I'm going to, let's start the slides. Let's see here. So we're sharing the screen. So we will do this. Okay, and is the title slide showing up there?
No.
Let's see. I should be sending out on my feed. Can you, well, I should be, looks like I'm sharing. Let's try this. You see a title slide down?
Yes.
Yeah.
Full personal internet history.
What do you see now?
Slide.
You got the title?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So I'm kind of calling this the Maker City, Web 2, and Urban Activism and what we can learn. You know, in listening yesterday, we heard, I thought, a few key things. Dennis Crowley was talking about how in the era of Web 2 and mobile tools, things seemed a bit easier. And today I want to kind of go back and look at that era. We also heard how important open data is as just a fundamental element or play in being able to build meaningful things with cities. That was a big idea that came out before you guys all went off to take a look at that city app yesterday that Dana showed you, in situ. And we also heard a lot about like how if you get everybody involved, this is really from Karen, things are so much richer and transformative. And for any of us who've worked with technology in cities, getting everybody involved is difficult, or else you kind of end up with the same old kind of cohort of developers as opposed to the rich fabric of the city. The book itself, Maker City, A Practical Guide to Reinvention in Cities, kind of came out of work that I was doing in open data, civic innovation, and work with teams of developers and people in San Francisco that were trying to use Web 2 to make the city more interesting. And my friend Dale Doherty, who created the Maker movement that was interested in how can makers actually create and improve the economy in the city. And all of this went on during the Obama administration, and the president convened several White House maker fairs. Now, what was really going on is we had teams from across the country that were focusing on bottoms-up innovation in cities, bringing in entrepreneurism and startups, and trying to bring in what was at the time called Gov 2.0 initiatives. And we had people come from all over the country, and the whole idea was kind of to spread the knowledge and to learn. I think one of the reasons we ended up with the book is there were lots and lots of great case stories, but no one city had the other people's case studies. And of course, if you're in a city saying we're going to do this very innovative thing with data and then we're going to have kids involved in education, the power structure of the city might say, what are you talking about? So we wrote the book literally so they could throw the book at them when people doubted what all this stuff was. And this came out of both the Maker movement. If you're familiar with the Maker movement, which started in the 90s and flourished like 10 years ago, it was about democratizing the tools of physical production, 3D printing and CNC machines, because we'd already democratized the tools of computing. And the idea was, how can you bring them together? And you know, any of these movements are hooked up to their time. And when we were doing this in the 2004, 5, 6, 7 time frame, there was a real concern in America that we were over-indexing for our big coastal cities, over-indexing for, say, coding and innovation, and under-indexing for manufacturing, for production, for middle skills in the middle of the country. And what we were seeing is cities were being very successful in the 90s and the 2000s, but wealth and investment was just very concentrated. You had all this investment in New York and San Jose and San Francisco, and the concept behind the Maker City was to smooth all that out. One of the big concepts that went on was simply how quickly could we push the kinds of things we think about in design thinking or startup thinking into our schools. Science, technology, math, experimentation, coding, fail fast and learn. One of the cities that did this best, it turns out, was Pittsburgh. When you looked at cities, Pittsburgh went from steel to software and from software to robotics pretty quickly. And Pittsburgh did this because it had a great foundation in the Heinz Foundation and a bunch of civic leaders who literally got together over breakfast and said we needed to evolve. One of the most successful things they did was at the Elizabeth Forward School, in a very poor school district, where they just said early on, we're going to put in a maker lab, and we're going to take the science teacher and the math teacher and the craft teacher and tell them they're actually all in the same integrated department.
The Dream Factory is a combination of 3 classes that were previously separated. The art room, the tech ed room, and computers.
All 3 teachers collaborate
and bring together art and engineering.
When it's hands-on learning, it's something that you want to do.
What we need are measurements. When you have a board, they go to the board.
They get ads to our traditional wood shop, metal shop.
Students are programming interactive games, building robots.
Do they want to do 3D printing? Do they want to do painting? Do they want to do sculpture?
This is not a gifted program. It's not an after-school activity. Every kid is getting this in our school.
And this is another cool thing. If you were like in 2nd grade, you might print out Stinky there, and a 4th grader would then sew Stinky. So you kind of had this intergenerational making bit going on. One of the things that became clear, even several years ago, if people will say, what is a maker city? Well, on some degree, it's a city full of can-do makers, multiple talents, trying to work on the city, which I'll get to. But we kind of said the definition of a maker city is a place that prepares its citizens for the future. The objective function of all of this ought to be people are more prepared in time of rapid job change. That's probably more true now with the dawn of AI than even back then. But I want to take you back in history in how all this stuff began, because it turned, just a maker ethos here, right? This ethos that we were bringing to cities really came right out of what software developers were doing. It came out of the open source and sharing culture, because before that, industry was much more closed. It came out of always learning and being curious, because with rapid change you had to. There was a real ethos of bringing experimentation and prototyping to cities, particularly because, as we'll see in a moment, we get to physicality of cities. A developer builds a neighborhood or a building, it's going to be around for 75 years. How could you prototype and learn so before you pour all the concrete, you have a sense for what's going on? I want to take you back to kind of almost how this all began. 2004 was the dawn of Web 2. Tim O'Reilly declared it to be Web 2. And what was really going on then after the dot-com crash is all of the new services were designed to snap together. This was the era of APIs, where the Google Maps API could be hooked to your app, could be hooked to a shopping cart, and this was one of the reasons people moved to cities. It was very easy to snap apps together and create things. So by the time we got out to 2008, San Francisco was crawling with Web 2 developers. There was just lots of it going on. And the other interesting thing about 2008 is we'd just gone through a financial crisis, which meant that the city was very liberal about trying to keep all the tech people here, and we had some pretty big problems to solve. But perhaps most interesting about 2008 is that was the moment when cities opened their data. President Obama opened data, and Gavin Newsom, who was our mayor at the time, ran around trying to get all his departments to share data so that so that the power might move to citizens, the private industry, so lots of people could put their eyes on things and not just the government. One of the first examples was crime spotting that was built by Stamen Design, really starting in 2007. Now, before there was open data, you had to work really hard to get it. They had a developer who would screen scrape every night any crime report, put it into a database, and then publish an API on his own and not tell the city about it. The city did find out about it and kept trying to shut it down because the IT department said people are using the servers too much. Eventually, the city thought sharing data was a good idea, and then here in San Francisco, we made it policy. This was also the era when everybody was getting iPhones, and there were many times that there was a problem that the government couldn't or wouldn't solve, and citizens figured it out. One of the great examples was in the nuclear accident at Fukushima. The government wasn't telling people where the radiation was. So people got radiation detectors shipped over from MIT. They hooked them to the iPhones, and then they started building the data of what was going on. In San Francisco, I started an organization called Gray Area. It was kind of the home base for artists and technologists, people who would create things with Web 2 and art. And one of the first things we started doing was creating these hackathons where people would come in and work on city problems. Literally, when the city opened the crime data sets and the food data sets, and you could find food deserts, and the transportation data sets, people started pouring in. And this is what amazed me. You'd go in, and there would be designers and urban activists and hardware people and journalists messing around on their time over the weekend making stuff, which I thought was amazing because that was a lot of talent. And in fact, if you looked at the talent that came in, you had all of these people, hardware, software, journalists, designers, activists, lots of design students. Bureaucrats came in. Bureaucrats who were unhappy their city couldn't get anything done came in and said to the developer, I've had this idea, could we do it tonight? And that created a whole bunch of energy. Here, our arts organization was in the Tenderloin, which had a lot of crime. Crime is represented by docs, but when we put it up as part of an art exhibit, the police came in and that was my crime, thank you for noticing. At this time, in 2008 or so, here's another example, which today would seem simple, but it was a big deal back then. The Tenderloin was very noisy. And you kept calling up the police, and it's too noisy, and they're like, prove it. So we then just stuck up microphones all over the place with Wi-Fi and captured the data. Now, today that would be trivial, but back then, when you turned it around and you went to the government with your own data set, that was a big deal. San Francisco opened its data, and I was working with a guy named Jay Knapp, who was the head of innovation. And the whole concept was if we open this up and we get either private industry to build things or the citizens to look at it, that would create a lot more transparency. It also created a competition. Immediately after we did it, Mayor Bloomberg said, well, it's in New York, we'll open its data, but you get $20,000 if you get it right. And Gavin Newsom didn't think that much of that, so the next day he put a post up, said, we have an app store. So there was kind of this arms race to open the data. And the thing we found was that open data was an invitation. People would love to do something for their city, but normally you go to City Hall and you just get a parking ticket and pay your taxes. The fact that it was an invitation meant that people were coming in and building things. I went off to the leaders of the city and said, we have to build stuff. Look at what all this data does. And all the leaders of the city, the supervisors and the bureaucrats looked at me and you're a geek. You're just enthusiastic about data. Part of what I realized was if you wanted to bring about change in a city, instead of telling the government they had to do stuff with it, you had to give them things. So we then had the idea, what if we could get all sorts of developers to start building stuff that candidates wanted? And we could make innovation and the use of Web 2 politically the basis of the upcoming election. So we conspired. In 2011, there was going to be an election that year. I worked with the city and we declared it to be the Summer of Smart. That was a direct ripoff of another summer of the Summer of Love that we had in '67. So it seemed like time to have another memorable thing in San Francisco. 11 people were running for mayor. They all needed an idea. And so we thought if we brought developers together and had ideas, we could come up with ideas worth stealing. And literally, developers would come up with things, share them with the candidates, and they would try to compete to say, here's the best idea for the city. So over 3 weekends, we took 3 major themes. We brought people in on a Friday night, did a hackathon around community development, public art with the speaker, and Hacksaw weekend, and then all the mayoral candidates came in. We focused on sustainability, transportation, and energy, and people come in from Copenhagen. And then I brought in former Secretary of Agriculture Ann Veneman, and we focused on food and nutrition. This was actually Anthony Townsend from NYU's concept of the city becoming a civic laboratory. To show you how well this worked, here's David Chu, who was at the time running for mayor, and I asked him, why are you spending your Sunday with us?
When you are in a campaign, you are constantly looking to push the envelope and to challenge yourself as well as the city, and you're looking for innovative ideas. So in a campaign, it's almost like you're having it's like policy entrepreneurship. And so candidates, especially for those of us who are running for offices that we haven't held, you're looking to identify issues that you can champion and also to work on. And so I think there's a lot of policy entrepreneurship happening in this campaign.
Okay, that was one candidate, but he wasn't going to be outdone by another candidate. So the next candidate comes in and says, all right, I've been hanging out with the fire department, and I have a big idea for our city.
The Fire Act is a collaboration that between the Department of Emergency Management, City Attorney's Office, the Fire Department, that we actually got as a result of something that we learned from the San Ramon Valley Fire Department, where the Fire Act basically takes trained CPR individuals who sign up for an app on their iPhone, that then they can be notified when someone is having a cardiac event, and they can see if they're in close proximity to that individual, that they can get there before the first responder, and perhaps provide some critical time-intensive care before the first responder gets there. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is the Fire App will then also transmit information about where AEDs, defibrillators, are located throughout the city, because that information is not really readily known. So if we have that information out publicly available, in the event someone's having a cardiac event, either that individual who's CPR trained, or another individual, or a member of the fire department that gets to a site can know where the nearest automatic defibrillator is located, and that technology is critical to helping those that are suffering a cardiac event survive.
This is amazing. We had candidates pitching each other ideas that our people came up with, and then at times people would go out and find there was a problem in the city, and bureaucrats would go with them. For example, it turns out we had bus data, but nobody knew if a bus broke down where it broke down. They just had a clipboard. So one weekend, someone started building an app to figure out where all the broken buses were, and this showed up in the paper the next week. It said, San Francisco has a bold plan for modernizing technology. It'll only take 5 years. But because people have embraced things like social networking and cloud computing, this weekend, people actually came up with it in a weekend. Now, this pissed off the IT department in the city, but we put all these ideas in front of the mayors at the mayor's debate, and they picked one to win. They picked this transit app that they said, we're going to build this thing out citywide. The Ed Lee, who became mayor, committed to it. A few months later, it turns out they hadn't built what they committed to. And the New York Times, of all people, called them out and said, San Francisco says it's innovative, but they didn't build the Muni app that they said they would. You could imagine, after this came out, 3 days later, the app was built. So this is a great example of just applying a little pressure to things. We took our inspiration from the activism of the 60s, of the Summer of Love. The difference, of course, was that in the 1960s, we protested the establishment, and what we figured out in 2008 is we would just write to its API. Or as Anthony Townsend pointed out, when he wrote a book about all this, I said to him, I know in New York we've got the Occupy movement. Up here we have API. No one knows what that means, but it looked great, and that's kind of what we were up to. All right, this downside of this, if you tell a whole bunch of developers and software people and metaverse people, you're going to go work on cities, eventually some yo-yo's going to show up and say, I have built an app to fix the homeless. And then this will upset everybody else in the city who says, no, it's actually complex to solve urban issues. You can't just go write some JavaScript one night and you're going to fix homeless. By 2012, we got a little more organized, and we said, if we're going to work on these things, we're going to write a community brief. We're actually going to bring actual people in the social service world together to write out, these are what the problems are. We're going to stick them in a room with a bunch of developers. We're going to give them a prize, but the teams that go out will now actually have to go visit people who do job development, or they're going to have to go out and understand how housing shelters work. So we wrote a brief. We built integrated teams of both geeks and people who understood social services. And kind of going forward, we merged that together, or else you just got too much zeal. And then we then said, here's how you go and implement that. Right? You outreach, you listen to the community, you do a prototype, you accelerate it, and then you can actually get funded to bring about change. By 2012, the battle of the app was won. Right? So this is all in virtual space, kind of like metaverse. Right? Everything was an app, it was data. But by then, Uber was out and Airbnb was out, APIs were being used. So then we said, can we start focusing on the physical world? Can we get people to prototype and build portions of the city to make them better by bending city planning laws? And we thought this would be a great way of giving people agency. If people actually felt that they could create a part of the city, that would give them a lot more input and voice than like going to a city planning meeting and just saying, I don't like that, or I do like that. Or even sitting in an app and drawing what a better place might look like. We were inspired by this guy. Jason Roberts was an activist who lived in Texas, and they had bad transportation where he lived in Texas. And he went to Europe and he saw the trolleys, and he came back and he announced that he wanted to have streetcars in Texas, and everyone said, you can't do that. So he announced he was creating the Oak Cliff Transit Authority, and the government said, you cannot have a transit authority, you're just a guy. He thought he was Robert Moses. Okay, he then went out and talked about this so much, even though the city wouldn't let him do it, he eventually won a $30 million federal grant because he had basically put the prototype out there, talked about it, put out his ideas, and the government listened to him and do it. We got so excited in San Francisco, and we thought, what if we deputized all of our citizens to come up, do urban interventions? We called it urban prototyping, and I showed up one day at a big hackathon meeting, and I said, everyone here is now deputized. You are all a commissioner for the San Francisco Prototyping Authority, which did not exist, but I was a maker, so we had badges. Now, at this point, what we did is we partnered with private industry. There was four cities, and Hearst had a part of town near the Chronicle building here, and they wanted to transform it into a development. The community wasn't so sure, so we cataloged every alley and every street, and we said to people, come up with great things to do to make this more livable and viable. We curated about 30 projects, and we gave them resources. We gave them tech shop, we gave them Autodesk. This is, here you can see they're all getting ready to 3D print something. And we declared that April 9th to 11th would be urban prototyping time. And then, as that happened, we then deployed these. So I'll show you a little video set to a music called Do the Prototype. That was also written by one of the people working on it.
There's a little something no one's talking about. It's a learning tool to work things out. 1 to 1, 1 to 3. Get hands on, come along. Dee-wee! It's really off the cheap out of sight. Let's do the prototype. There's no wrong or right. It's a learning tool. But we take it cool. Try and feel that let's do the prototype.
It's people's living room. It's where people come out and socialize, and as San Francisco's civic spine, we can't erase barriers that are dividing us right now in a space like Market Street. We're going to have a lot of trouble solving a lot of other issues in the city, and so we have to start with the public spaces and creating spaces of connection and of empathy, and from there I think we have the energy and the positive thoughts of how to address the deeper divisions that are challenging the city today.
It's like building community.
So one of the important things to do this is to measure the difference it makes and show people what on, right? That was a typical day, here was a day with this. Gale Architects did tons of evaluating by using social media and interviews and online surveys, and we could show races were mixing, people were having more dwell time in the city. By the way, we did this back then. Our city needs it even more right now because, again, we're kind of in a crisis. One of the things that came out of this, it was a sense of empowerment, partly, I think, driven by Burning Man, because people go to Burning Man and think they can do anything. One of the great things that came out of it was the Bay Lights, which was the idea that we could turn to our bridge and just turn it into a big piece of art. Here's a quick clip from that.
We're all moths, we all get this attraction to light. We move into this space of reflectiveness.
What could turn out to be one of the most flamboyant and expensive works of public art in Bay Area history appears to be close to reality.
When you stand next to the bridge, it's like being next to the Grand Canyon.
If the Bay Bridge was your canvas, what would you do on it?
You just move into a space of awe and terror, and we all suddenly sit there transfixed just by the magnitude of this piece.
Leo Villarreal is the light sculpture artist with the grand idea.
No one's ever done this before. This is something very unique. You look down on one side and it's 525 feet to the water. The other side is 250 feet to traffic.
Leo's interpretation of our discussions vastly exceeded anything I could have dreamed of. The impossibility is the thing that makes it possible. The impossibility is what inspires people to act around it.
With this entire project, there's certainly no guarantees. It's very complicated, it's very large scale.
People want to see it happen. And it shouldn't happen. These things they're not supposed to happen. The system is designed to say no.
You have to try. That's what I've learned, is that you just have to go for it.
One of the big things about this moment is it was combining physicality with the virtual. You made something on a screen and it showed up in the city. We had a similar experience in New York. The most annoying thing about the subway system is waiting, and you have no idea when the train's going to show up. I was in New York, and this is Ernest Tollerson, who was working to open the data from the MTA. It was the first time that the MTA was going to take their data and share it with developers so that we might know when the trains were coming. And so when we were meeting that day, he's explaining it. There's a developer saying you're using the wrong format. We need it in this format. There's a game designer who's trying to put it into the form of a game. These were some of the first prototypes that literally came out a few hours after people had access to the first data. Bill de Blasio, who wasn't mayor yet, shows up and says, we need transparent open data, it's going to make the subways better. It's a hackathon, you have to keep people going all night. I showed up with the cupcakes that were appropriate to the occasion. And then a bunch of great, you're living with this stuff today, but a bunch of very fun apps got created. Some people put it to Gershwin to see what the trains were. Others took other principles, full glass, to show where the turnstiles were to understand how busy it was. And this one I liked. They took a Verizon phone, a T-Mobile phone, an AT&T phone, stuck in a box, went all over the subway so that they could crowdsource which carriers were best in which subway to then make the carriers improve the quality of what they were doing. These ideas of the Maker City would take off. So, for example, Kokomo, Indiana, started saying, when we come up with our city plan, our comprehensive plan, we can't just do it with, city councilmen. We're going to need city and students and makers, and they kind of took a class of makers and worked with the city to come up with what the plan was. And this essentially led to a lot of people thinking about how important change was locally. That you could bring about change locally, you could use technology locally. Jim Fallows wrote a book about this. I did. There was the new localism. Barcelona came up with its own view of things. And essentially what a lot of people said is a great maker city attracts talent. There's an ecosystem that lets people both economically create things and solve problems for the city. You need affordable industrial space for them to work in. It creates STEM potential. This works well in innovation clusters or near universities. And its design is to both tell the story of heritage and also create a more resilient ecosystem. Just to wrap up, another key portion of all this is you'd love to go from simulation, knowing the real problems and the real constraints of your city, and then into solving something. Sometimes when I see metaverse city things. I see a bunch of fantasy cities, or I see what something might look like. At the same time, I will see a real digital twin that's based on the real problems that an engineer is working with. We want to expose the problems of a city to real people solving problems. This is MIT's Cityscope, and in Cityscope, you're actually moving these Legos around, and there's some machine vision, and you're changing in real time with an agent-based simulation things like how much transit density will there be, how dense will the apartments be, what kind of jobs are going to put in there. So you're doing real-time changes of things like zoning and density, and then you're kind of looking at how it might affect co-working or culture or things like that. Those kinds of simulations, which I think are really important, the kind of simulations we need to improve cities, are the things that speed up and get people talking and changing things the most. This is an example of how that kind of data can be worked out. Let's go to the present day. We are living in a world where in the last year, suddenly we have all sorts of AI available to us. And my friend Anna was pointing out to me yesterday, we don't have enough housing in San Francisco, you may know. And the housing you're looking at does not exist. This was created a year ago in Midjourney, and this is Marin County, just over the Golden Gate Bridge, and there are no condos there. But someone started saying, well, if we solved our problem, it would look a lot like this. And then the same woman said, and if we solved our problem, there would be a train, looked suspiciously like a New York subway going over the Golden Gate Bridge. Just to be clear, this is a deep fake. That does not exist, although it was proposed in the 1960s. But there's something palpable in the current era about connecting up AI and the ability to make these simulated worlds with modeling to see what it might be, and citizen engagement, as we saw with the Maker City, make it possible. And to just finish up, in San Francisco lately, you may have followed that really original boom bust city. You may have read that during the pandemic, a lot of coders moved out because they could take their laptop anywhere. But just as they were moving out, of course, the next boom moved in. Just to give you a quick example, I was in New York on October 25th, ran into Lynn Hirshman, who's a very well-known artist, and she said, Peter, I'm writing a movie with GPT. And I thought, okay, well, you're an artist, maybe you're writing a movie with GPT. She said, no, artificial intelligence is changing the way that I create. The next night, I'm at Lincoln Center, and a opera debuts, written with GPT, visuals by Rafik Endal, also done in that case by Dali. And the entire creative team shows up and says, we are making this opera with these new tools because we have to get into that next generation. The next day I come back to New York and there's an art opening with Dali. We had the whole ecosystem of open AI and stability there, both the financiers, the artists, and the sister companies that were doing gene folding or material design. Right? This is all in 1 week. The next night, there is the AI and Film Festival, and I realized you can go from text to movies, and there's a whole new creator economy coming in. The world is tagged with film noirs, and you can write something, and it'll get the film stock and the look of all of it done. That December at Gray Area, the same arts organization that we started this stuff 15 years ago, we started doing participatory world building with artificial intelligence. And we have people working on prompt engineering and creating meta worlds, both using AI and trying to solve for what we're attempting to accomplish. And that brings us to the present era. In San Francisco now, coming out of the pandemic, there isn't a weekend that there isn't a hackathon or an AI party. We've already been dubbed the Woodstock of AI in one part of town. And it seems to be that this form of technology, together with the can-do attitude and problem solving, is kind of where we're heading now. That's the reason that I say a maker city is an invitation, right? It's an invitation to take the tools, work in the city, and go solve problems. It's something that really began 2004, 2008 with Web 2, went through a burst of civic innovation. And I think in this metaverse era, there are a lot of learnings that we can bring to it in terms of how to work with government, how to put very diverse teams together, how to use open data, and how all of us kind of working with tech can work with physical cities to make things better. So, thank you very much. I wanted to share all that with you, and that concludes the formal portion of Maker Cities.
Hi, my name is Nick Hoffman. I was a captain at Open Wayne Brigade of Good for America for like 8 years, and your presentation was just like a clip show in the last decade. I think we had a moment of realization around 2016, obviously the presidential election, when our innocence in civic tech was kind of lost, and we realized that we couldn't count on our institutions to always uphold the things that we made for them. And there was this barrier in the beginning between technology and policy. We didn't want to touch policy, we were just making tools to improve the businesses. And by the end, Stan Hawkins like talking about, we do want to affect policy, we want to have influence on policy too. And this is all to say that like now, going into this Web3 movement, I don't feel this sense of like values-based stuff as much. It's much more complicated now. Like the world is much more gray, and it feels like going into metaverse. There's the whole Web3 is based on the lack of trust, like trustless systems, and yet when we have these institutions in crisis, so like how do we work our way from this decentralized moment of trying to run away to maybe find another world to like come back to our cities and institutions that exist now and like improve them? Is this like a process that we're going through? I mean, I sometimes think of virtual technologies like a cocoon where we have to sort of incubate and work through some difficult stuff that we never have to deal with. So, I mean, just having experienced that whole era and this new one, how do you think of it now?
Yeah, well, first of all, everything you said, I feel about these two eras. And, when I put this talk together, I've been doing a lot of work right now applying this to real estate development, working with communities where we're actually going into a part of town and applying these principles and kind of private development, getting permission from cities to do things. And, as a real project as opposed to kind of all the app stuff we're doing. But I looked at all of this and I did have a sense, boy, that was another era and we were really optimistic and a bit innocent. So I think some of what I see is that a lot of the metaverse city stuff that I see, sometimes it's based on fantasy cities as opposed to actual real city stuff. And I also think there was a moment there in civic innovation when open data was new, visualization of stuff were new, people would look at these things and they would, you would see a food desert and you build an app around it, people cared about that, and we've become a little inured to it. Look, I think the question is what are the things that can bring about change? I'm optimistic that there's some tight linkage between if you're building an actual, take San Francisco right now and all of our housing stuff. Everybody screams about it. One thing we haven't done a great job is building a game or a simulation that actually gets people to understand the trade-offs, right? In other words, if you're going to have more density, dial up some of the transit here. Here's what it would look like. I saw a board game recently in New York that allowed people to really do all the trade-offs in energy. And there's a board game in San Francisco that has all of the real estate policy stuff that's put in there. So, I would love to see metaverse city-style games with real trade-offs introduced in elementary school so kids could teach their parents and one could have an actual conversation about the local trade-off things that we need to do and what needs to happen. Because I think that stuff is simulatable. And I also think that some of the values of Web3 do come from lack of trust. And the cynic in me thinks that each technology movement starts as a utopian thing, right? The web was a very utopian thing. It didn't have any defenses built into it. Web 2 started with this very utopian degree where we work together, and then we now criticize it for being concentrated. And now we're attempting to do it again in a deconcentrated way. So I think there's a lot of possibility, and I kind of lament the fact that 10 years ago, there was a lot of civic energy that we saw at Code for America and other places. And I think recapturing that and putting it back into the tools that we're doing now, I think it's not just that it's more complicated. I think that the tools are a little more inward focusing. They're less about solving real problems, perhaps.
Yeah. Thank you. Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Peter. Thanks so much. I think it's really, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay. Hey, Peter, I just want to say thank you so much, and I really enjoyed your presentation. And really, and the reason why is actually I grew up in San Francisco. And as a matter of fact, Lyndon B was actually my classmate back in middle school days. So it's really refreshing to have someone like yourself who actually have demonstrated that some of these things could really affect changes in a city like San Francisco. And my quick comment, because I apologize, I have to run for another meeting, but I really want to follow up with you because there are a number of citizenships, a number of us in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, that are trying to affect more changes. Because one of the challenges, as some of you guys may know, San Francisco currently has one of the lowest, occupancy rates in major cities. And I see here, in New York City, I'm so happy that the energy in New York City is actually back. But there are a lot of challenges right now facing San Francisco, including homelessness, including other issues that we're facing. So it's very refreshing, Peter. I think what you've done and those things you've done are tremendous. So I'm going to follow up with you on that, and Liz and your team. Thank you so much for this amazing event.
Yes, thank you for putting it on. I've been learning so much listening these last couple of days, and again, thanks, and let's put these ideas to work.
Other questions? David, did you have your hand up?
No, but one thing that always comes to mind here is that...
Peter, can you hear David?
Sure.
You're fine, yep.
One thing that always comes to mind is the legacy technical stacks. Not just the data, but the business processes. And do you have any insights as to how the metaverse, bringing things into the metaverse, can be used to change the business processes of cities?
Are we talking about the problem of, so we're talking about behavior change, right? So we're saying, how can we change the way that we issue permits or the way that we make decisions on how quickly buildings get built?
Yes. How do we influence that?
Yeah. Well, I guess there are two approaches to that. If you look at the stuff that we were doing back in the day, in many cases, we would prototype something and route around the process and then stick it in their face, right? So if they said it took this long to get a permit, we would prototype something and okay, here it is working, would you like to have it? Or like that Muni app where it took the day and the IT department said it would take 5 years. Part of the issue is that some of these are really tough political issues. For example, California is struggling to make it faster to build housing. And Governor Newsom's been playing whack-a-mole with every county that's supposed to come up with a plan, but they all come up with excuses, so he's trying to lower the boom. The mayor here, I think, has just passed some legislation that makes it impossible for any one citizen to object to stuff. So I think that some of this is just tough policy stuff, but I think on the simulation side, for example, with housing, imagine a metaverse thing that could take San Francisco and Marin and literally you could dial in. Oh, you want to solve housing? I'll just turn the density slider to here, and now you'll see what it looks like. And if you don't like how it looks there, we'll change the architecture slider. Okay, if you do like that, here's what we're going to have to do with transit. So some of it is, if you can render palpable this better future you're looking for through a metaverse or through a model, and then you give people some trade-offs, so when they fight about it, they're move their sliders around and see what policy looks like. That was a little bit of what MIT was doing. I think that's one way of speeding it up, because what we'd love to see is some way of policy leaders, instead of ducking out of it, stick them in a room and close the door and it's a charrette and you have a model and once you like it, that's what we might do. That's a little bit simplistic, but I do think that's a great use of metaverse, which I think of as great display, great modeling, and a lot of collaboration in its best.
Hi, Peter. It's Greg Lindsay from Cornell Tech, where I actually work with Anthony Townsend sitting next to me right now. So
Anthony's there. Hello.
Joint references. Peter, I was going to ask you, just quickly, given all your encounters with various clueless levels of government, I'm curious your thoughts on really where government should build the bench strength of the metaverse. So, for example, if we're here in New York, we heard from the CTO the city, Matt Frazier, his office is thinking about creating an AI czar, that sort of centralized figure. Companies have done chief metaverse officers. Like, what are your thoughts in terms of like, should that expertise live in every department, and how do they start building it? Do you hire specifically for it? Do you cultivate younger staffers? Like, where do you embed that so they're more responsive?
This is a great question. Also, to point out how different San Francisco is now. Now, as Anthony knows, when we did it back then, we ended up we had a head of innovation who actually took things seriously and experimented a lot. And that was great because he moved really quickly. And I think if you stick something in every department, it's a little bit more line-oriented. I mean, every department has to put out its big line processes, but they can't do the innovation thing. Right now, we're doing practically nothing because we're a city in crisis, right? I mean, it's like, it's homelessness, it's crime, it's needles. So this is a very tough place to ask the city to innovate, which is part of the reason that kind of private components of the place innovate. I've been doing a bunch of work with our economic development team, and we've been thinking a lot about how we have to hook up San Francisco and the Central Valley, our bioeconomy and our agriculture economy, because food security is a really big deal. We have a lot of that expertise here, and we probably will power off by connecting up California's two biggest economies. So I'm beginning to work kind of at the state level because I'm looking at my city and thinking my city's really busy with big problems, but I know the state cares about both its interior, agriculture, Central Valley, and the city, and the Biden administration cares about that. So that's kind of one way that my view has changed. I'd love to hear from you guys because how you're organizing all that. I think in San Francisco, I literally have started connecting state and federal government doing stuff in that space just because we're in a different phase right now. This is not the Web 2 era. A lot of tech people have left, and we have a different problem set. Anthony, you're in the audience. What do you think?
It's kind of blown my mind providing all that context. I think there's so much to learn from civic tech and maker movement for how we think about mobilizing something that's sole objective is not profit as we build out the metaverse. So
yeah,
give us a lot to think about.
Well, yeah, and look, we're in a moment with the bad. Remember, Web 2 started very optimistically because it was all about open stuff. And right now when we think of Web 2, we're like, oh, Facebook is big, and who the hell knows about Twitter, and then there's Google, and then Microsoft and OpenAI. So we're sitting there with Web 2 became big, and Web 3, which is all supposed to be about highly distributed open stuff, we've just gone through, a bunch of weird scandals in crypto and concentration. So it's a weird time to be very optimistic, and yet, I think if we think through where are the best uses of these technologies that both engage people, might bring about change, might show a path for hope that's data-driven, I think that would be a very interesting place to apply that effort. By the way, Anthony, my mind was completely blown. I was rereading your chapter on all of this stuff last night, and I suddenly remembered exactly how everything happened, and I looked at all of this, and I was caught between, that was amazing, and boy, that was an optimistic moment back then, right? So it's interesting to look back in history only 12 years.
Yeah, optimism is part of energy, and we really need energy.
Yeah.
And I think it's a critical component because we can't do what we don't have energy about. Danny, you had a question?
Question, comment. Thank you. First, it was an amazing presentation. I really loved seeing how you kind of took us through the time of open data when all of us were.
Can you hear Dana?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, nice to meet you. I'm Dana from INSIC2, and I presented yesterday. I'm excited to see your presentation and what you did in San Francisco. I think you're right that we're so optimistic about open data, and today we become more mature to understand that making data open is not enough. We need to think about the user experience and how people can access and capture and translate effectively this information in a way that empowers them and promotes the shared values that we try to bring to cities. What's interesting to me with thinking about Web3 and specifically augmented reality, you talk about it, a lot about simulation, and then you showed all the interventions on the street level. And I think that maybe the one failure of simulation is the top-down, which I think could kind of be merged today into the streets through augmented reality, through distributed experiences. And I think we come to this Web3 with AR with more of a product-oriented mindset. I'm an architect in my background, and I think we understand today that a city or our streets are products, and they should be treated like products that are good for their users, understandable, empowering, and that's what I believe AR can bring. So thank you. I think, the next thing that I think was amazing in what you showed is how you proved that people do care and do engage. So these little interventions out there, the one thing that the non-optimistic people always say is that, people will never be part of the change, will never take part of city planning or changing their communities. People want to just concentrate on their own lives, but when you communicate things effectively and put it differently in front of them, you prove that they do become part of it. So it's amazing. Thank you.
To the point about energy, because you should go where the energy is and you kind of need something to get anything done. It's definitely the case here in San Francisco. We're the last city to recover from this. But starting about a year ago, but really last fall, as the AI stuff took off, that's all anyone talks about here, because we're kind of a groovy city and we're a boom and bust place. But when I put that last sequence in about the AI, literally every weekend there's a couple of hackathons. Every party I go to, you have to do a haiku about what's good or bad about AI. And this idea that somebody started taking parts of Marin in San Francisco and using Midjourney to render what it would look like if it had the right density, and this is what the transit would look like. I think given the fact that everybody's focusing on this stuff, and these tools are very good at the various what-ifs and what a policy might look like, as well as rendering to a supervisor what might have been an $100,000 architectural rendering speculation project before from some architecture firm, which today you could do at night in Midjourney and bring it to class or to the city the next day. I think there's power in using that energy for civic good, just because these tools are astounding. There's one project I'm working on in San Diego, and we're doing a whole thing with regreening a part of town and teaching people kind of agricultural methods. And one of the artists, Mary Madden, who's a New York artist, used Midjourney to just conceive of all sorts of things we might do with that part of town. And she did it in an evening, and I'm convinced that some landscaping firm would have charged $500,000 in 4 months to do what she kicked off after a quick phone conversation.
Great presentation. As I look out at the city line here of New York and think about how metaverse and simulations can actually help us really reimagine cities and how they actually work, I think of, I used to work extensively in the automotive industry, and one of the things that is coming a lot sooner than people may anticipate is vertical takeoff and landing vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably, certainly within the next decade, we're going to start to see those of significance. So I'm wondering if you've seen or done any work around how cities will change, transform dramatically as a result of VTOLs.
I meet a number of entrepreneurs who are completely excited about that, and then I ask them about the policy side of it, and they're like, we should look into it. Literally, I've heard it. And there was a guy over here telling me all about it, and I said, do you know about the Pan Am building and the helicopter that used to be there? And he goes, no. I said, well, they had a helicopter on top of Pan Am building, but the landing gear gave way one day and it crashed, and there's never been another helicopter that's been allowed to take off from a building unless it was a medical emergency. So I don't know whose mind you have to change, but there's a long memory in New York that it didn't go too good. So there's a big policy issue there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But again, it's there's a global trend around this, isn't there? It's like
yes, right. there's lots of work going on it. It's definitely going to happen. There's amazing stuff with it. So I think one of the interesting questions is, what does it get zoned into, and what would it be on? And I've actually not seen a lot of that in city plans. That's a great question.
I actually think you brought a ton of energy into this room. It's been phenomenal, and we've got to stay connected in the right ways here.
Well, I look forward to getting caught up with you guys in the actual city as opposed to being here out in the metaverse saying hello.
Yeah, but you would have had a red eye, right?
I don't know what I would have had. No, I would not have been there because it would have worked out. That's why we're here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Anthony, I'll come see you in New York next.
Thank you. Vanya, you're on our Metaverse Momentum Index.
I know, I think I'm the only thing that